It's bound to have profound impact on how we think about defence and defence priorities. There will be really important short-term operational issues and also a longer-term questions that have to be resolved. In the short term, it seems to me the two big headings will be, first of all, questions around the extent to which we and other NATO countries reinforce our forward presence in existing NATO member states who will be feeling pretty vulnerable. They're already feeling pretty vulnerable, but even more so if we see permanent Russian military presence in Belarus, who will make countries like Lithuania, Poland, Estonia and Latvia all feel even more edgy than they are now. And I think it will be important to reinforce the British forward presence, along with that of the United States and Germany and France and other major Western powers. And I'm sure that will happen, but that will have costs. That will involve more personnel, better equipment, higher operating costs, and so on, and a higher operating tempo, all of which will have significant impacts on other priorities. Then the second area, which I think is in a way more difficult to analyse because it's very fast moving, and rightly so, is what support, if any, the UK will be giving, military support the UK will be giving to Ukraine's armed forces. And that's an area, of course, fraught with risks of escalation, but it's also something that the UK government's made it very clear it would want to support in some way, as have the Americans. And that will put particular strain on parts of our armed forces, including special forces. It also could well involve a significant degrading of our own stockpiles. Some of the weapons we've been providing to the Ukrainians so far have come from British stockpiles because that's what's immediately available. So it's going to have a lot of impact there. We've got to make sure we don't degrade our own operational readiness in order to support Ukrainian forces, but a whole set of issues there, which again will affect what the UK does. And more generally, I think in the short term, it means so much attention in the Ministry of Defence, as indeed across government, is going to be focused on responding to Russian aggression in Ukraine, that other things will suffer. I think many of us remember the vigorous debates during the integrated review about the Indo-Pacific tilt, and certainly some people arguing for a really quite radical pivot of UK defence planning towards the Indo-Pacific. And I think the events of recent days and weeks are a pretty strong reminder of why the government decided that the military aspect of the Indo-Pacific tilt would be rather limited, and the UK's main defence priority has to be NATO. I don't think you're going to see many voices right now arguing that the UK should pivot its military forces further towards China and Asia, at least in the short term. In 10, 15 years, who knows? But for now, and I think for the foreseeable future, by far the most important British defence priority has to be maintaining and enhancing its commitments to NATO. A good example of that will be in relation to the Royal Navy, which is in the Navy are almost the most flexible part of our armed forces in terms of geographical flexibility. The importance of anti-submarine warfare in the Northeast Atlantic, keeping track of Russian submarines, that's going to be even higher priority than that has been. And also perhaps a greater emphasis on land attack capabilities in our Royal Navy, where perhaps we are rather less strong. And then for the Army, the integrated review, I think, reflected something of a competition, if you like, between NATO commitments and commitments to the wider Middle East for stabilization, support for stabilization operations, supporting allied forces there. And I think what we'll probably see out of these events is more emphasis in the former rather than the latter. Not, I think, necessarily the UK moving towards building much more substantial armoured forces. In any case, that's more of a medium and short-term issue, but certainly having the agile forces which can move quickly to provide assistance to others, or indeed to act directly on a maybe on a lighter basis than the heavy forces we saw during the Cold War. That's, I think, the UK comparative advantage to which the integrated review pointed. So I think across the board, we're going to see an increase in operational commitments, along with, I think, some increase in operational spending and greater concentration of UK military effort in the NATO area. But, we're moving at least some way back, I think, towards where the UK was in the latter part of the Cold War in the 1970s and 1980s, where NATO was very much our main area of effort, and out of area was by implication less important. So at least in military terms, I think this crisis is going to mean the UK becoming and leaning forward to become the leading European military power within NATO, and global military deployments will take a backseat to what is the real national priority right now in defence terms. There will be a revisiting of the UK's defence budget and indeed the priorities within that budget, as there will be in the United States and other NATO allies. Certainly, I think it's hard to imagine that rethink. It won't involve, on the one hand, more of a reorientation towards NATO and to some extent away from the rest of the world in military priorities. But I think it may also see a greater priority being given to operational spending, on spending to enhance the readiness of our forces, the ability of at least large elements of our forces to react rapidly to crisis, and at least in relative terms, perhaps less priority on long-term equipment spending. Now, I suspect in current circumstances that doesn't mean less planned spending on equipment, but I think in terms of priorities, the Russian threat is most of all a near to medium term. It's a threat for the next 5 to 10 years. That's when it needs to be addressed, and that's when our forces really need to up their game and plug any gaps that may exist, because this is the period when we're most worried about the extent to which the Russian aggression in Ukraine will extend elsewhere. Spending on equipment, certainly in terms of maintenance of equipment, that may be a priority. Capital spending on equipment that generates capability only after 2030. A lot of extra money was put into that in the integrated review. But now I think the priority may be to focus a little bit more on those areas of the defence budget which were given a low priority in the IR, and that's really day-to-day spending, where all the emphasis was on making savings, and there are areas in which savings can be made, but there are also areas in which we do need to enhance spending. I'm sure the Ministry of Defence will seek to get as much of that extra spending from the operational reserve, which the Treasury holds, because that may be easier to access than getting a revision of the spending review settlement, which really was only agreed recently. But it may be that spending review settlement also has to be revisited as the dust settles. Certainly, if there's a view that this level of threat is going to be much higher than it was when the IR was decided a year ago.